Good morning to all of you. It's great to be with you virtually. I'm going to follow up on several of the themes that Amanda introduced, and it's good to participate with her because I've known Amanda for many years now, and several of you out there. So, and I'm also going to try to connect many of the themes we've been talking about. I think that the conversations about education during the pandemic have largely focused on logistics, access, and that seems to be dominating the conversation about schools after they return. And those are important considerations, certainly, especially in the United States, where we have large numbers of people who don't even have access to internet at home. It's estimated about 12 million children are engaged in no learning at all right now in the United States. And I'm not sure how that compares to some of the other countries that are represented here. But access is certainly pertinent. We have many school districts, because they were not able to get screens into the hands of children. And we know right now that many children are relying largely on their parents for support with learning at home. And many, if your parents are working because they've been deemed essential, and we know that low-income workers are more likely to be deemed essential, the people who are working in our supermarkets and producing the food we eat, that means there's no one at home to help the kids. And we also know that these are the same families that are much more likely to be impacted by the virus itself. And because their parents are out working, much more likely to be exposed to the virus and bringing that virus home to their families. And that's one of the reasons, again, why we're seeing a disproportionate impact on in the United States on people of color, on Black and Hispanic workers and their families, and therefore also the mortality rates disproportionate amongst these populations. So I'm not sure. I guess we're having a technical challenge here. I've been working with many others in thinking about how schools could be different. And so I want to start by posing some questions, because I read a quote from Roxane Gay. Roxane Gay is an author here in the U.S., and she wrote an editorial last Sunday in the New York Times. And she said that many people, eventually we will, I'll paraphrase, eventually we will find a vaccine for this virus, but we still have not found a vaccine for racism. And even as some clamor for a return to normal, we need to realize that normal is what many of us yearn to escape. Because if you think about what normal represented, what the status quo represented, in many of our countries, is the ways in which education serves to reproduce the existing society that we live in, existing patterns of inequality. And I know that not all countries that are participating in ARC are troubled with the same kind of history of racism that the United States does. I often point out that, although Canada is by no means a perfect nation, Windsor, Ontario is located right across the river from Detroit. Detroit was once one of the wealthiest cities in the world because it was home to the auto industry. Today it's a dying city. But right across the river, there's Windsor, Ontario, with a stable Black population. And you have to ask why. Why is Windsor a thriving community while Detroit is a dying community? And the answer to that question is rooted in our history, but it's not simply rooted in history. It's rooted in ongoing policies. Detroit is in the state of Michigan. Michigan is a place where the courts ruled not long ago that a child did not have a basic right to literacy. We should think about that for a moment. That children are required by law to go to school, but there's no requirement that they learn to read and write while they're in school. Now, fortunately, that ruling was recently reversed. The courts, instead of fighting the case, the state decided to settle the case, and we'll see what it means. We'll see whether or not there's any genuine progress. But as Amanda said already, what the pandemic has exposed, it not only exposed our existing inequities in the U.S., it also exposed that we have no social safety net in the United States. Schools are the places where kids get fed. And so when schools aren't open, it means there are kids who are not eating. Schools are places where kids have access to some degree of health care. So again, when schools aren't open, those needs are not being met. For countries where, right to health care, right to child care are basic rights that you've had for many years, this might seem unusual. But I want you to ask yourself, as you think about your country, because I've had a chance to spend time in several of the participating countries, and I know that you also are challenged by these issues. New Zealand, which is a country that has been held up, and rightfully so, for its great response to the pandemic, is still a country where we see the inequities that correspond to race and ethnicity play out in the society. And I think that what this speaks to is that unless there's a concerted effort to ensure that those who have historically been excluded, who have historically been oppressed, have access to schools that affirm their culture, that affirm their language, that affirm their rights, that education merely continues to reflect the patterns we see evident in our society. And so I would ask each of you, when you look at your data, do you see schools or do you see education producing patterns of mobility that cut across the board? Or does race and ethnicity continue to be implicated in those patterns, implicated in patterns of achievement and patterns of opportunity? Amanda spoke, I think, quite eloquently about the need to address gaps in opportunity. And those gaps are glaring in the United States, but they're also evident in other countries. When I was in England, I can show over a year ago, in Birmingham, was struck in speaking to the educators I met at how similar the challenges in that country are to those that we face in this country. That where poverty is concentrated and disproportionately, in England it's interesting because you have white poverty and you have poverty amongst people of color. You see very similar patterns. You see schools that struggle. You see schools that are often unable to effectively deliver the kind of education that children need. And we have to ask ourselves why, what's wrong? Because before we can transform, we have to understand what is the problem we're trying to fix. And I would say some of the problem is in the policies we pursued, policies that have relied on pressure as a strategy for improvement, threats on educators that have not built capacity within schools. And when we seek real capacity building occur, and we have a few examples of these, and my colleague Michael Fullen has written, I think, quite effectively about this. What we see is that schools can, in fact, be a resource and can, in fact, serve as a beacon of hope in our communities. What distinguishes those schools from the others is the ways in which they approach and partner with the families and communities they serve. And here I want to commend a school that I know well in New Zealand, in Auckland, a school founded by Anne Milne that works hard with the community, and this is in a poor area, to create a school where the culture and the language of children is embraced, where children learn and are empowered as learners to use education to address problems in their communities. And that commitment to problem-posing education, to an education that enables kids to have the tools they need to meet the needs of their families, to apply knowledge in ways that allow them to become active participants in their society, that approach is consistently what we need to begin to counter the patterns of reproduction inequality that we see evident so often. A few years ago, I was in Alaska, And I was invited there to speak to all of the principals in the state. And after I spoke, the Commissioner of Education for Alaska got up to speak before the crowd and made what I thought to be a very candid confession. And he said, very simply, he says, we do not know how to educate indigenous children in Alaska. All the evidence shows it. The children are not performing in academically. They are not reading. They are not making the kind of progress we hoped for. They're not graduating the way we would expect. And he said, what's worse, they have the highest suicide rates in the nation. And they are suffering in numerous ways. And then he proceeded to describe what the state would do. And it was the same thing they had been doing, which is focusing on academic standards and accountability on educators. And after he spoke, I had a chance to speak to him. And I said to him, I was touched by your honesty when you spoke, by your willingness to admit that the state essentially did not know what it was doing. But then I was troubled that the recipe, the remedy you looked to was more of what you've been doing. And he looked at me and says, well, that is our policy. And I said, well, maybe you have to ask a different question. He said, what's that? I said, the problems you're trying to solve in the indigenous communities were not always there. They didn't always have high suicide rates. They didn't always have problems with substance abuse and violence. These are new problems that are directly tied to the treatment of indigenous people. And perhaps if the state were to stop some of what it's doing in those communities, you might see different outcomes. And he was perplexed, and I said, I can show you communities where that's occurring right now in the lower 50 states. And I described schools that working with right now in New Mexico that have begun to do what I've described. These are schools on some of the reservations that have the highest rates now of the coronavirus, the Hopi reservations, but have started in a different path. They are, again, affirming language, affirming culture, developing teachers on those reservations, because for so long they could not even recruit teachers to work there. They're finding that they can train teachers amongst the children who can become professionals and serve their communities because they have a deep commitment to their communities. And what they're showing is that this notion that the problem is inherent in these communities is just a myth. In fact, it is when we begin to see education as a resource that is tied to the rights of all people to develop themselves and to affirm their history, their culture, their language, when that right is extended to those who've historically been denied it, education can, in fact, become a genuine resource. So I want to encourage all of you, wherever you are in the world, to begin to ask the same question that Amanda posed to you: is how can we make schools different when they return? When this pandemic ends, when we begin to return, let's not simply allow either concerns about logistics, which are very real and pertinent, or concerns about the finances. And the finances are going to be, I think, a major concern, because in many of our countries, we're entering a period of depression now because of the pandemic, because the economies have stalled, and because there is less revenue coming into the state and therefore less funds available to schools. We're going to have to turn to our communities like we've never before, turn to our parents like never before, to ensure that our schools can continue to function. And if you think about it for a moment, that's in fact what we've had to do during the pandemic. It is the families that have been responsible largely for making sure that their children not only plug in, but are able to engage in learning during this period. And we're now going to have to build on that relationship after the pandemic, because at a time when we have fewer resources, we're going to have to rely on our human resources to begin to meet the needs of our communities, particularly those that have been most hard hit during this pandemic. So, I've been thinking, how do we make sure that as we return, that the needs of these communities that have been most hard hit, that are hard hit both from an economic standpoint and a health standpoint, but also from the economics and the social inequities that Andy spoke about a moment ago. How do we begin to allow this disruption that has occurred, enable us to have schools that are now more responsive, more effective at meeting the needs of their students? I'm not seeing my slides, so I'm just doing my best to recall what I had to share. But let me share one more example. Steve,
2 minutes, Pedro. Let me have to stop. Sorry. 2 minutes.
All right. So, because, we've grown accustomed in the United States to the deep inequities, and some schools have learned to address those, that is to figure out how to tap into community resources. And one of the schools that I work with most closely here in Los Angeles, a school called Social Justice Humanitas, where 100% of the kids are poor, 100% of the kids are Hispanic, and has the 4th highest graduation rate in the city. And I've gotten to know that school well, and part of what they do is they spend the first 3 days of school simply getting to know their students, to build relationships with their students. And I asked the principal, I said, you're taking away time for instruction for this kind of relationship building. He said, no, we get the kids to come before school starts. I said, how do you get them to come? He said, we just tell them they must come, and they do. And because they do, we get to know them, and they get to know us, and they get to be comfortable with us. And so they'll tell us when there are problems. They will tell us when they feel insecure. And this is also the only school in Los Angeles that I know of where the students evaluate their teachers. And when I ask teachers, what's it like to work, they say it was a great school because we feel so supported. I said, what's the hardest part? They said the hardest part is the honest feedback we get from our students, because they don't hold back in telling us what they think about what we're doing and what they need. And so I'll close with this, because I met with a group of students there, and I always say that when you meet with students, you get an honest sense of what's happening in school. And I asked them, how often are you inspired by what you learn in school? And all the kids raised their hand. I said, you're all inspired? I said, I find this hard to believe. I said, what did you learn yesterday? And the girl shot up her hand. She said, yesterday we learned about the forced sterilization of women that was occurring in this country in the 1930s. It was part of the eugenics movement that was designed to prevent women from groups they believed were unequal from reproducing. I was so troubled by it, I went home and I talked to my parents about it. We went online to study it and to figure out why this happened, where it happened, who was responsible for it. So I was inspired. And I thought to myself, when kids get a good education, they end up wanting more education. And that should be our goal, the schools that not only inspire, that nurture that desire for children to learn and to continue learning even after the school bell is rung. So, Steve, thank you. Sorry we had this technical problem, but I'm happy to be with you.